I had a girlfriend of 3 years in my late teens. I saw her as the love of my life, cue the sloppy phrases here, and we had a lot of good times. But as time goes on, both of us were planning to go to different universities. We would, on occasion, have arguments. To give a bit of a backstory, though, before I get into this, throughout my time living in my parents' house, I have always experienced a sort of female presence that seemed to look out for me from a young age. Little did I know that by having a girlfriend, it would appear to make this presence become more energetic. It made its presence more known. The first episode, I guess you could call it, was when my girlfriend and I were having an argument. It resulted in some tears and words said both ways. As soon as she said she was going to leave, I kid you not, my bedroom door swung open slowly. It was closed properly beforehand, I know that for sure. At the time, I was more concentrated on the argument, though, than the possible gust of wind blowing through the house or something causing it to open. The second episode was, again, in an argument with my girlfriend. She went to the bathroom to wipe her face, and she thought she could hear a group of women coming from outside on the street, laughing. It was hysterical laughter from one woman, or one source. On inspecting the outside, there wasn't anyone in sight who could have done it, and my girlfriend said it sounded like the laughter was directed at her. The final episode of this is the reason why I'm coming here on Reddit to tell my story. All of these stories link me to being in the bathroom, or in my bedroom, which was underneath a small attic. All of these stories link me to being in the bathroom, or my bedroom, which was underneath a small attic. My dad and his dad, my grandfather, went up to see it when they first moved in around 40 years ago, and they found a bunch of women's clothing piled in the corner of the attic, with 8 shoes for the right foot placed in a straight line along the wall. Creepy, right? Well, when the relationship with my girlfriend was coming to an end, it began to tear up our families in the process. After she left my house and me, one night I was finally able to get to sleep. My nan slowly opened my door to check on me to see if I was awake. She wanted to say goodnight, as was her habit, but this time I remembered that she closed the door really quickly instead of saying anything. That was really unusual for her, as it was part of her routine that she would walk around our house to check on everyone who was in bed and to say goodnight before she went to her own. I forgot this, though, since I was too drained by my girlfriend leaving and just went to sleep. The next day, I walk downstairs for breakfast and I see my nan preparing her cup of tea, as she always does. What I hear next haunts me to this day. "Good morning. I didn't realize your girlfriend was staying over last night." "No, she went home just before I went to sleep." "Well, you don't need to lie. It's fine if she stayed over. She has before." "Nan, I swear she wasn't here. You can even read my texts. We both sent them saying goodnight." There was a long pause before Nan said, "Well, when I opened your door last night to say goodnight, I saw a girl sitting on your bed. I thought it was her, so I closed the door when she looked at me like I'd done something wrong." This made me stop what I was doing as shivers ran down my spine. I realized who it may have been, as I also remembered what my dad and grandfather had found in the attic. The Keeper Man. All the kids loved to play on Draker's Lane. It was a really wide street with huge conifer trees all along each side. Cars would rarely come down Draker's Lane, and there were only 12 houses on the street, despite it being long and spacious enough for at least 12 more. One of the houses was always so still and quiet, like many houses in many neighborhoods across the country, but there were rumors about this house. Who lived there, how long it had been standing there, what happened there when the moon was full or on Halloween. It was a huge Victorian old house, ornate but neglected, with a large black slate swooping rooftop and small gray stone gargoyles around the rim above the large windows. No matter how sunny the day, the house always looked dark and gloomy, and the most popular rumor was that it belonged to the Keeper Man. The Keeper Man was very tall, about 7 feet. He wore all black with a long tattered coat that had long frayed coat tails. He had a gaunt white face, as white as the pale moon. His eyes were as black as coal, and he wore a wide grin that looked like his face had been slit from ear to ear. Legend has it, he didn't walk but glided along so you could never hear him coming. Every Halloween, the children would dare each other to run up to his front door and rap the large brass knocker 5 times, saying, keeper men, come out to play." Not one kid that we knew of had ever completed the whole task. Some didn't even make it up the path, some not up the steps, some only knocked 3 times, but not 5. Some didn't get all the way through the necessary words to summon him. Year after year, the old Victorian house stood on Draker's Lane. Halloween would come and go, and no kid had the guts or the stupidity to finish the necessary, scary act of calling the keeper man out. Halloween came. Me and my friends, now in our 20s, were home all at once for the first time in nearly 10 years. We had had a few beers and shots at the local bar, and someone, can't remember who now, suggested we go down to Draker's Lane for old time's sake and complete the task of calling the keeper man. Jenna and Max were dead set against this. Jenna was always a scaredy cat, and Max claimed he didn't want to play a kid's game, but he looked frightened as well. Damien, Sally, and I thought it would be fun, and seeing as we were buzzed from our drinks, we managed to convince the other 2. We walked to Draker's Lane. It wasn't far, and as we looked up at the old Victorian house, now in even more crumbling and in disrepair, we saw the moon large and full above it in the dark night sky. Jenna wanted to leave there and then, as we all knew that the keeper man was at his most scary and most powerful on a full moon on Halloween. Sally laughed at her and pulled her by the hand, saying they would do it together. But Jenna wriggled out of her grasp and noped her way out of it. In the end, Damien stepped up. He was quite drunk and laughing like a hyena at this stage. I thought it was a hoot. We all watched Damien walk up to the top of the steps and stand in front of the wide black door, the paint peeling away from it. He took the heavy brass knocker in his hand and rapped 5 times on the door, each time pausing for effect and looking back at us in mock horror. We were all laughing at this stage, but I started to feel dizzy. Maybe it was the alcohol, or tiredness as it was getting late, but suddenly I wanted out. I wanted to leave now and get far away from here as possible. Damien was about to say the words when Sally shouted, "What's that?" pointing up at the window of the first floor of the house. Pressed up against the glass, standing in just underwear, was a little boy. He looked to be standing on the windowsill and pressing himself against the cold glass. My blood ran cold, and I felt a bit sick. What the hell was that? What was happening? This was a joke that was now beyond creepy. We didn't know what to do, and Damien ran down to get a look too. He looked horrified, and then whispered the name, Matthew. We all turned to look at Damien, suddenly realizing why the little boy looked familiar. Behind the little boy, the keeper man suddenly appeared, looking even more terrifying than the legend said. He placed a long, bony hand across the little boy's mouth and dragged him back into the darkness. Damien ran to the door, but we grabbed him back. He'd begun to sob, as had Jenna and Sally. Max was busy calling an Uber to get us out of there. It came in 4 minutes flat, and we were all piled in, practically sitting on Damien to keep him in the car and calm him down. We got back to the bar, and all stood outside in the cold, not wanting to go on, but not wanting to all go home and leave one another. Damien had gone pretty much catatonic now and wouldn't speak, other than to occasionally whisper Matthew, his brother's name. His brother, who had been missing since we were kids, who hadn't been seen since he was 10 years old. Max turned to me and said what we had all been thinking. I guess one kid did finish calling the keeper man after all. He who listens for wishes. It was late in the evening, and I was sitting alone on a park bench and on the phone in my coat pocket, hoping beyond hope it would start vibrating. She hadn't returned my calls so far, but maybe this time the message I'd left was good enough to change her mind. Every fiber in my body was hoping and begging she would. A man approached from across the park. his footfall so quiet he'd gone from a blip in the distance to sitting on the next bench over without me even noticing. It would have been courteous to bid him good evening, but I was too focused on the device between my fingers to pay him any mind. I heard a deep intake of air, not dissimilar to one a child would take right before bursting into song or scream. The man spoke, loud enough for me to hear. I wished he'd call me back. His voice was soft and peaceful, like a father reading a bedtime story. Though his words had derailed my train of thought, it was the sight of his intense, unbreaking gaze in my peripheral vision which urged me to respond. "Excuse me?" I turned to him and found myself a little taken aback by his appearance. He was all in black, wearing a trilby, polished shoes, clean dress pants, and a long coat, stretching from his knees to his shoulders with preacher's collar peeking between the folds. He had a short, well-groomed beard and strong cheekbones beneath his unblinking stare. Even seated, I could tell he was quite tall, and I questioned how someone of his stature might have been so light on their feet. His lower eyelids were pronounced, almost swollen, as though he'd been awake for days or crying for hours, but the telltale redness of either affliction was completely missing. As he grinned sheepishly at me, his lids arched upwards, and with the glow from the street light above, made his eyes look like crescent moons gleaming in the night sky. He was, by any definition, handsome and alluring, but he looked as though he'd been plucked from another time period. He touched his gloved fingertips together and then dangled his now combined hands between his parted knees. "That's what you were thinking just now. I wish he'd call me back. Isn't that right?" I blushed and nodded. Had it been that obvious? "You know the old saying about wishes," he said. Who was this man? What was he doing parading around the streets of Cambridge in that antiquated get-up of his? Why'd he felt the need to come bother me? I forced a chuckle, trying to make it sound more amused than annoyed, though the scale clearly tipped towards the latter. "Yeah, well, I'm not asking the universe for much here, mate." His stare intensified to the point of making me tense. I could feel my toes getting cold as they gripped the soles of my shoes. I wanted to shoo him away, but there was something about him that I found abundantly charming and debonair. I found myself uncharacteristically enraptured by him, as though his charisma was a web and I was an insect. "May I tell you a story?" he asked. I quirked a brow at the odd request. He didn't smell drunk, nor look disturbed in any way, but still my mind screamed no. Unfortunately, my mouth was too polite to vocalize what my brain was urging me to say. "Sure." His smile intensified, and his half-moon eyes narrowed into waxing crescents. "Marvelous!" He removed his trilby and held it against his chest with one hand, while the other cupped his knee. Underneath his hat was a thin carpet of receding, dirty blonde hair just about the same length as his beard and mustache. The preacher rotated towards me and wasted no time starting his story. "I knew a man once, much like you. Oh, but not nearly as handsome, don't worry," he winked. He too was sitting on a park bench much like this one, stewing over his latest failed relationship. She'd started out as just another notch in his belt, but he'd grown quite fond of her. He'd even started contemplating starting a family. I'd been looking at rings the weekend before she ghosted me. Out of the blue, she'd just stopped answering my calls. No fight, no goodbye message, nothing. "I can relate," I mumbled. He hummed, looking at me with his signature sheepish grin. "Can't we all?" "So what happened to your friend?" He laughed. "Oh, he wasn't a friend. More like—" He paused and squinted as though in deep thought, then continued. "More like a client, of sorts. Well, this man sat on a bench and watched her house and called her over and over again, wishing, begging, and praying she'd pick up. She never did, of course, but all those wishes he sent out into the ether were bound to fall on prying ears. And so, on a night much like tonight, as the man was on the verge of tears and staring at his phone, a handsome, very well-dressed, very suave stranger approached him and offered him a deal." I snorted. "Let me guess, sell his soul for a phone call?" The preacher laughed. "Oh, heavens, no! While the handsome stranger did have mysterious powers, they were nothing of that sort. No. He asked for 1 year. 1 single year of his life in exchange for a guaranteed phone call. You see, the stranger, This attractive, kind, charismatic stranger had the ability to act as a sort of... Again, he squinted, turning his eyes into crescent moons in the process. A kind of supernatural telephone operator of sorts. He could guarantee the man's call would go through. Hell, he could let any person speak to anyone they desired, all in exchange for a single year of their life. I snorted and twirled my finger around my temple a few times. He sounds like a loony to me. The preacher shuffled closer and leaned in, his deep brown eyes looking into mine with overwhelming intensity. Maybe he was. But if so, then there'd be no harm in agreeing to the bargain, would there? And if his claims were legitimate, well, he paused to smirk, then what's 1 year? What would anyone have to lose? 1 less year in the twilight of his life, half there, half not, pissing and shitting himself in a nursing home? 1 tiny, itty-bitty year in exchange for the potential of reuniting with his beloved and living a lifetime of happiness by her side. This, the man decided, was a bargain. He accepted the stranger's deal, 1 year of his life for a phone call. I loosened my tie and looked up at her apartment building. The lights were off and the curtains drawn. Was she already asleep, or had she gone out drinking with friends again? So, the guy actually said yes? The preacher nodded enthusiastically. Why, of course! I was skeptical. In my experience, if a woman doesn't want to answer, she's not going to answer. Nothing's going to change that. You can only sit back and hope she'll return the call. And it worked? I asked. His call went through? He smiled with such excitement he looked 20 years younger. It most certainly did. The handsome stranger was no liar. My leg twitched, and I jumped. Had my phone just vibrated? No, it wasn't vibrating. It was just a muscle spasm. I sighed. So, why are you telling me this? My boy, it's simple. I simply wish to make you the same offer I made him. I snorted. A year of my life for a phone call. I can see you're skeptical, but think of the man in my story. He stretched his arm out and held his hand within reach. What harm could it possibly do to you to agree? I can see you're skeptical, but think of the man in my story. He stretched his arm out and held his hand within reach. What harm could it possibly do to agree? If I'm a sham, nothing will happen. If I'm not, your wish will be granted and she'll return your call. I looked at him in disbelief. I wasn't buying it, not one bit. At the same time, it would have been rude not to humor him a little. I shook his hand firmly, looking him in the eyes. All right, deal. Excellent, he said as he shook my hand firmly. In a graceful movement, he dropped his hat back on his head and pushed himself to his feet, ready to leave. I stopped him. I'm not even sure what possessed me to ask, but something did. Wait, aren't you going to tell me what happened? Once he made the call, was the man able to get her back? Did they live happily ever after? A hint of malice flickered in the preacher's smile at my questions. He cupped a hand to his chin pensively. No, not quite. After the handsome stranger left him be, the man took his phone and dialed her number, cautiously optimistic it might actually work. She picked up, but at first all he heard was silence. It can take a few seconds to establish the connection, you see. He began picking lint off his long black coat. That gesture, for some reason, left me with a sinking feeling at the pit of my stomach. Something about it seemed so sinister. His head eclipsed the streetlight and endowed him with a broad halo. With his long, slender frame towering above me, he looked like all-powerful God, and the lint looked like his subjects, which he callously tore from their homes and discarded with little regard. I shivered. He continued. The man heard static, then slowly the static faded and made way for a soundscape unlike anything he could ever imagine. He heard the screams of thousands that seemed to echo off the walls of a deep cavern. He heard the sizzling of fire and the searing of flesh. When he strained his ears, he could just barely hear the sound of sparks flying as metal collided against metal. Frazzled and shocked, he made to hang up, but then he heard the girl's familiar voice, weak and thready. "Make it stop," she sobbed. "Please make it stop." He dropped the phone and it shattered into pieces, but the sound still came through the broken speaker. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rising. It was a story. A stupid story, but it had its hooks in me. I stuttered. What did he do? The preacher shrugged and waved his hand dismissively. He tossed the remains into the woods and ran home. He couldn't sleep that night, far too frightened by what he'd heard. But the horror only truly sank in the next day when, in an effort to return to normalcy, he He read the morning paper on the bus. He saw her name in the obituaries. She died 3 days prior. He smirked. And since that day, every time he picks up the phone, he hears her cries for help and the screams of the damned. But there's nothing he can do about it. The call already went through. The connection can't be broken. I'm not gonna lie, I was shaken. But in that same way you get from watching a horror movie. You know it's not true, but you're still rattled. Still a little afraid of the shadows in the corners of your room. The preacher brought a hand to his ear. "Oh my," he said, his tone light and playful. "I'm afraid I really must get going. I hear quite many people making wishes tonight. I mustn't keep them waiting." He whistled as he started down the road, adjusting his hat. I laughed a little, trying to shake away the nerves his story had instilled in me. I yelped as I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. When I pulled it out, I saw her name on the screen and felt a rush of excitement and anxiety. It's a coincidence, I thought, and I believed that. But at the same time, there was the faintest doubt in the back of my mind. A different kind of hesitation took over. Was I ready to talk to her? Would I be able to convince her to take me back? What could I say that I hadn't said 1,000 times over voicemail? This could be my only shot. The preacher stopped for a moment and looked back at me, smirking wide. "Well, aren't you going to answer?" I swallowed hard and looked at the phone just long enough to hit the accept call button, brought it to my ear. As I looked back up at the path, I felt a chill when I saw the preacher was gone. There was static before a frenzy of screams erupted from my speaker. Amidst the voices, as though far off in the distance, I could hear the vaguest hint of her screaming for help. Thank you very much to all three Spookbook, Men in Lysett, and Moonbather84. You guys over on Reddit are amazing for letting me do this, and I actually would love to do more of your stories if you don't mind. If anybody else has any stories, feel free to message me over on Reddit. I am Little Horror Stories, so yeah. Feel free to say hi too, I don't mind. I also tend to apparently upvote a lot of cute things. Not just about the horror stories, unlike the actual channel itself. So, if you enjoy actually listening to these bloopers at the end too, give me a like. And if you want to hear more of the actual stories themselves, feel free to like, subscribe, and click that bell icon. I only upload once a week, so I won't be inundating your message boards. If you have any artwork as well, I'm over on DeviantArt at Little Horror Stories. No spaces, just Little Horror Stories. And anyways, have a good evening, and beware the dark. There's more than just humans that lurk there.